If a man proposed to you right there in the street just after taming a wild Mustang before the whole town, would you say yes or walk away? The church bell struck 7:10 on that Tuesday morning in March, and Clara Ashworth stepped down from the westbound stage with nothing but a carpet bag and a hat box that rattled when she walked. Durango's main street stretched before her like a muddy promise, all timber storefronts and hitching posts, the air sharp with pine smoke and the distant ring of hammer on anvil. She'd come to teach school, but the first thing she saw was Ezra Hawkins trying to break a Mustang right there in the street, dust flying, the horse bucking like fury incarnate. A crowd had gathered ranch hands betting silver dollars, shopkeepers leaning in doorways, children pressed against window glass. The Mustang was a painted mare, white and brown patches catching the morning light, and she had no intention of being broken. Ezra sat deep in the saddle, his hat somehow still square on his head, reins loose in one hand while the other rested calm on his thigh. No yanking, no spurring, just riding the storm. "Bet you $5 he's on the ground in 30 seconds, called out Pete Garrison from the mercantile steps. "Make it 10, said Clara, setting down her bags. "He'll be on that horse when the dust settles." The crowd turned to look at her, this woman, in a grey travelling dress with her hair pinned neat and her voice steady as bedrock. Ezra caught her eye for just a moment, tipped his hat without losing his seat, and that's when the mare made her final, spinning leap toward the sky. When the dust cleared, Ezra was still mounted, the mare standing quiet with her head down, flanks heaving. He dismounted slow and easy, ran a hand down the horse's neck, then walked over to Clara while Pete Garrison counted coins into her palm. "I'm not impressed," Clara said, though her eyes lingered on the way he'd handled the reins, gentle but sure. Ezra nodded, serious as Sunday. What would it take? More than that. He considered this, thumbs hooked in his belt, then reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded paper, his deed to 40 acres north of town. "Marry me," he said, "and I'll deed you half my land." The crowd went silent. Even the mare lifted her head to listen. Clara looked at the paper, then at Ezra, then at the faces watching from every doorway and window on Main Street. The stage driver was already loading bags for the return trip east. The schoolhouse sat empty at the end of the street, waiting for a teacher who might or might not stay. "You don't know me," she said. "I know you took the bet," Ezra replied, "and I know you won." She folded the deed paper once more and handed it back. "Ask me again at Christmas. If you still think it's a good idea, I'll give you an answer then." The church bell marked 8 o'clock as Clara picked up her bags and walked toward the schoolhouse, leaving Ezra standing in the street with his hat in his hands and a folded deed that suddenly felt like the most important document in Colorado territory. By October, Clara had 23 students and a reputation for fairness that stretched from the mining camps to the ranching spreads. She lived in the teachers' quarters behind the school, kept a garden that produced the best tomatoes in 3 counties, and could solve disputes between cattlemen and farmers with the same calm logic she used to teach long division. Ezra brought her fresh milk twice a week and never once mentioned marriage, though he always found a reason to linger, checking the schoolhouse roof for loose shingles, splitting kindling for her stove, listening to her students recite their letters through the open windows. He'd expanded his herd from 12 head to nearly 50, built a proper barn, and started wearing his good shirt to town on Tuesdays and Fridays. The hat box sat on Clara's mantelpiece, and inside it she kept letters from her sister in Philadelphia, her teaching certificate, and a small bundle wrapped in blue silk that she never mentioned to anyone. Sometimes in the evenings she'd take out the silk bundle and hold it by the lamplight, but she always put it back before anyone could see. "Winter's coming early," Ezra said on the first Friday in November, unloading split pine logs beside her door. "Almanac says we'll have snow before Thanksgiving." Clara looked up from grading arithmetic papers. "The children need to learn their multiplication tables before the weather turns. Some of them have long walks home. I could drive the Jenkins children in my wagon," Ezra offered. "Their place is only 2 miles past mine." "That's kind of you." He straightened, brushing sawdust from his hands. "Clara, I've been thinking about Christmas," she said without looking up from her papers. "I remember. It's not Christmas I'm thinking about now. It's December 15th. She set down her pen. "What happens December 15th? "The territorial inspector comes through. If enrollment drops below 20, they'll close the school and send the children to Grand Junction for their lessons. Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach. 3 families had already moved on, following rumors of silver strikes in Leadville. The Morrison children would likely leave with their father's job transfer to the railroad office. That would put them at 18 students, maybe fewer. How do you know this? She asked. Judge Morrison mentioned it when I was filing my expansion papers, said the territory's looking to consolidate schools, save money. Clara stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains where the first snow already dusted the peaks white. If they close the school, the families with children will leave. If the families leave, the town dies. Not necessarily, Ezra said. A town can live on cattle and mining, but it can't live without people who want to build something lasting. She turned to face him. What are you asking, Ezra? I'm asking if you'll marry me on December 14th. A wife has more reason to stay than a schoolteacher does, and a married woman can petition the territory to keep her school open if she's willing to take half pay. The church bell struck 6 o'clock, and in the distance, Clara could hear the children's voices as they walked home through the gathering dusk. She thought about her sister's letters urging her to come back east, about the bundle in the hat box that she'd carried from place to place but never unwrapped, about the 40 acres of good grazing land that Ezra had offered to share. Is that a proposal or a business arrangement? She asked. Both, Ezra said, but mostly a proposal. Clara walked to the mantelpiece and took down the hat box, opened it, and pulled out the silk bundle. She unwrapped it slowly, revealing a small tin daguerreotype of a man in a Union uniform, young, serious, with kind eyes and a smile that suggested he'd rather be anywhere but in front of a photographer's lens. His name was Thomas, she said. We were engaged before he enlisted. He died at Antietam. Ezra looked at the photograph, then at Clara. You loved him. I did. But that doesn't mean I can't love someone else. She rewrapped the daguerreotype carefully and placed it back in the hat box. December 14th, then. But I want a real wedding, not just papers signed at the judge's office. Whatever you want, Ezra said. I want the whole town invited. I want Mrs. Henderson to play the church organ. I want the children to sing, and I want you to promise me something. Name it. Promise me you won't try to change who I am. I'll still teach school as long as they'll let me. I'll still speak my mind. I'll still beat you at checkers every Sunday night. Ezra smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him since that morning with the Mustang. Clara, if I wanted to change you, I'd have asked someone else entirely. The snow started falling as he walked home, big wet flakes that melted on the ground but promised more to come. Clara stood at her window and watched him go, one hand resting on the hat box, already planning lessons that would carry her students through the winter and into whatever spring might bring. December 14th dawned clear and cold, with 3 inches of fresh snow on the ground and the church bell ringing steady across the valley. Clara woke before dawn and made coffee by lamplight, her wedding dress hanging from the rafters like a pale ghost in the darkness. She'd sewn the dress herself from ivory silk that Ezra had ordered special from Denver, working by firelight in the evenings after her students went home. It was simple but elegant, with pearl buttons and lace at the collar that had belonged to her mother. Today, she would become Mrs. Ezra Hawkins, and tomorrow she would petition the territorial inspector to keep Durango's school open. But first, she had something to finish. Clara took the daguerreotype of Thomas from the hat box and held it by the window, watching the snow fall past the glass. 7 years had passed since Antietam, 7 years of teaching in different towns, of keeping her heart carefully locked away, of pretending that being alone was the same as being independent. I'm getting married today, Thomas, she whispered to the photograph. To a good man who breaks horses gentle and keeps his promises. I think you'd like him. She kissed the glass over Thomas's face, then wrapped the daguerreotype in its silk and placed it not in the hat box, but in the small wooden chest where she kept her most precious things, her mother's Bible, her teaching certificate, the first letter she'd received from a grateful student. Some memories deserved to be treasured rather than carried. The church was packed by 10 o'clock. Every pew filled with ranchers and miners, shopkeepers and their wives, and all 23 of Clara's students dressed in their Sunday best. Mrs. Henderson played hymns on the organ while people filed in, stamping snow from their boots and hanging coats on the pegs by the door. Clara walked down the aisle alone, carrying a bouquet of pine branches and winter berries that the children had gathered for her. Ezra waited at the altar in a new black suit, his hair freshly cut and his hands steady at his sides. When their eyes met, he smiled that same quiet smile she'd seen the morning he'd gentled the Mustang, and she knew with sudden certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. Judge Morrison performed the ceremony, his voice carrying clear to the back of the church. When he pronounced them husband and wife, the children burst into song Beautiful Dreamer in three-part harmony, just as Clara had taught them. Ezra kissed her soft and sure, while snowflakes drifted past the colored glass windows, and the whole congregation cheered. At the reception in the church hall, Pete Garrison raised a toast with apple cider and declared that Durango had gained not just a new family, but a partnership that would see the town through whatever troubles lay ahead. The territorial inspector, who had arrived that morning and witnessed the wedding from the back pew, quietly announced that any school with such community support would remain open indefinitely. Clara danced with her husband to fiddle music played by old Joe Hendricks, spun in a circle while her ivory dress flared around her ankles and her students clapped in time to the music. When the evening wound down and the last guest had gone home through the snow, she and Ezra walked hand in hand to the cabin he'd built on his 40 acres, where a fire waited in the hearth and coffee bubbled on the stove. "Mrs. Hawkins," Ezra said, helping her out of her wedding coat. "I like the sound of that," Clara replied, then added with a smile, "though I'll still be Miss Ashworth in the schoolroom." "Whatever makes you happy," he said, and kissed her again while the snow fell soft against the windows and the future stretched before them like an unwritten page. Spring came late to Colorado that year, with snow lingering in the high passes until May and the creek running high with snowmelt. Clara had been married 5 months and was expecting their first child by Christmas, though she hadn't told anyone yet except Mrs. Henderson, who'd guessed from the way Clara rushed outside during morning lessons and came back pale around the edges. The trouble started with a letter that arrived on the Thursday stage, addressed to Ezra in legal script that made Clara's stomach tighten before she even opened it. The letter was from a cattle company in Denver, offering to buy his land for 3 times what he'd paid for it if he could provide clear title. "What does that mean?" Clara asked, though she suspected she already knew. Ezra read the letter twice, then set it down on the kitchen table. "Means someone's challenging my claim. Says there's a prior filing on this land that predates mine by 6 months, but you filed properly. I saw the papers. So did I. But papers can be forged, dates can be changed." He rubbed his jaw, thinking, "The cattle company wants this whole valley for summer grazing. If they can break my claim, they can probably break the others too." Clara walked to the window and looked out at the land they'd built their future on, the barn Ezra had raised with help from neighbors, the garden where she'd planted tomatoes and beans, the pasture where his cattle grazed fat and content. Their cabin sat on a little rise that caught the morning sun and sheltered them from the worst winter winds. It was home in a way that nowhere else had ever been. "Who filed the prior claim?" she asked. "Document says a man named J.R. Morrison. Filed in Denver last August, before I even looked at this land." Clara felt her blood turn cold. Morrison. As in Judge Morrison. Could be coincidence. Morrison's a common name. But Clara was already reaching for the hat box on the mantelpiece, pulling out the bundle of papers she'd kept there since her wedding day, their marriage certificate, Ezra's original deed, and a copy of his land filing that she'd insisted on keeping for their records. She spread them on the table and studied the dates and signatures with the same careful attention she gave to her students' arithmetic. "Look at this," she said, pointing to Judge Morrison's signature on their marriage certificate. "Look at the way he makes his capital letters. See how the J curves back on itself?" Ezra leaned closer. "I see it. Now look at this signature on the prior filing." Clara placed the cattle company's letter beside the marriage certificate. J.R. Morrison. Same handwriting, same flourishes. The clock on the mantel struck 2 as they stared at the evidence spread before them. Outside, clouds were building over the mountains, promising another spring storm. Clara's hand moved instinctively to her belly, where their child grew in secret, and she felt a fierce protectiveness rise in her chest like floodwater. He married us, she said quietly. He looked us in the eye and pronounced us husband and wife, knowing he was planning to steal our land. We don't know for certain. We know enough. Clara began gathering the papers with quick, decisive movements. I'm riding to Grand Junction tomorrow. The Territorial Land Office will have records of every filing, including the original documents. If Judge Morrison forged that prior claim, there'll be evidence. Clara, you can't ride 40 miles in your condition. She stopped and looked at him. My condition? Ezra's face went red. Mrs. Henderson mentioned. That is, she thought maybe. I'm 3 months along, Clara said, and I can still ride better than most men in this valley. Besides, you need to stay here and talk to the other ranchers. If they're coming for our land, they're coming for everyone's. That evening, while Ezra rode out to spread word among the neighbors, Clara packed supplies for the journey to Grand Junction. She put the hat box in her saddlebag, along with her teaching certificate and marriage papers, insurance against whatever tricks Judge Morrison might try. As she worked, she thought about the baby growing inside her, about the school that needed her, about the home they'd built on land that might not legally be theirs. The storm broke just after midnight, lightning splitting the sky and thunder rolling down from the mountains like the voice of God himself. Clara stood at the window watching the rain lash against the glass while Ezra slept, one hand pressed to her belly and the other gripping the window frame. Tomorrow she would ride through whatever weather the mountains sent, armed with nothing but documents and determination. But tonight, in the warm cabin they'd built together, she allowed herself to feel afraid for the child, for the future, for the life they'd dared to build in this hard and beautiful place. The church bell struck 3 o'clock, muffled by wind and rain, counting down the hours until dawn and the journey that would determine whether they had a future in Colorado territory or would lose everything to a judge's greed and a cattle company's hunger for land. The Territorial Land Office in Grand Junction was a 2-room building that smelled of ink and old paper, presided over by a clerk named William Chen, who spoke precise English with a slight accent that placed him somewhere far from Colorado territory. Clara arrived just as the office opened at 9 o'clock, her clothes damp from the previous day's rain and her saddlebags heavy with documents. I need to examine the original filing for Section 12, Township 3 South, Range 8 West, she said, placing her marriage certificate on the clerk's desk. My husband's claim is being challenged. Chen adjusted his spectacles and studied the papers. This filing is from last year. Are you certain about the challenge? Clara produced the cattle company's letter with its reference to the prior claim. J.R. Morrison filed the 15th of August, 6 months before my husband's claim. Morrison. Chen's eyebrows rose. The judge? You know him? Every clerk in the territory knows Judge Morrison. He's filed claims on half the good grazing land between here and Denver. Chen rose and walked to a wall of filing cabinets, though I should mention Mrs. Hawkins. Clara Hawkins. Mrs. Hawkins, there have been questions about some of Judge Morrison's filings. Questions that reached the territorial capital in Denver. Clara felt her heart jump. What kind of questions? Chen pulled a thick folder from the cabinet and returned to his desk. The kind that involve federal investigators and accusations of fraud. But I shouldn't say more until I've examined these documents. He opened the folder and began comparing papers with the methodical precision of a man who'd spent years detecting forgeries and altered dates. Clara watched his face, trying to read his expression as he held documents to the light and examined signatures with a magnifying glass. Mrs. Hawkins, Chen said finally, this J.R. Morrison filing is a forgery. The paper is correct. The stamps appear authentic, but the ink is wrong. It's a different formulation than what we used in August. This document was created no earlier than October, possibly as late as December. Clara felt relief flood through her like cool water. Then my husband's claim stands? More than that. If you're willing to testify about what you've discovered, the federal investigators would be very interested in speaking with you. Judge Morrison has been under suspicion for months, but they've lacked concrete evidence of document forgery. The church bell in Grand Junction struck 11 as Clara rode home through mountain air that smelled of pine and possibility. She pushed her horse hard, eager to bring the news to Ezra and their neighbors, eager to secure the future they'd built with their own hands. But when she crested the ridge above Durango just past sunset, she saw smoke rising from the direction of their cabin. Too much smoke, too dark, the kind that meant fire and trouble. Clara spurred her horse down the valley road, her heart hammering against her ribs. As she got closer, she could see the cabin still stood, but the barn was gone, reduced to smouldering timbers and ash. Ezra knelt in the wreckage, sifting through the remains, while a crowd of neighbors stood watching from a safe distance. "What happened?" Clara called out, sliding from her horse before it had fully stopped. "Judge Morrison," said Pete Garrison, his face grim. "Came by this afternoon with papers saying he was repossessing the land. When Ezra refused to leave, Morrison's men set fire to the barn. Said the cabin would be next if you folks weren't gone by tomorrow morning." Clara looked at her husband, at the ashes of everything he'd built, at the neighbors who'd come to help but couldn't do much against a corrupt judge and hired men with torches. She thought about the baby growing inside her, about the documents in her saddlebag that could change everything, about the federal investigators who were looking for exactly the kind of evidence she'd found. "Ezra," she said quietly, "I need to show you something." They gathered in the cabin, Clara and Ezra, Pete Garrison, Mrs. Henderson, and a dozen other neighbors who'd watched their community come under attack. Clara spread the territorial documents on their kitchen table, the same table where they'd first examined the cattle company's letter, and explained what she'd learned in Grand Junction. "So Morrison's claim is worthless," said Jim Webster, whose ranch bordered theirs to the north. "But what good does that do us if he's got hired guns and we've got families to protect?" "It does us plenty of good," Clara said, "because Morrison doesn't know what I found. As far as he knows, we're just stubborn ranchers without legal recourse. He'll expect us to fold and leave quietly." "What are you suggesting?" Ezra asked. Clara walked to the hat box and pulled out a sheet of her best writing paper, the kind she used for important correspondence with the Territorial Education Office. "I'm suggesting we give Judge Morrison exactly what he expects, a surrender. But first, we're going to invite him to a public ceremony." She dipped her pen in ink and began writing, her handwriting neat and formal. "Judge Morrison, my husband and I acknowledge the validity of your prior claim to Section 12, Township 3 South, Range 8 West. We invite you to join us tomorrow at noon in the church for a public ceremony transferring the deed to your name in the presence of the whole community. We believe such important business deserves proper witness. Respectfully, Mrs. Clara Hawkins." "You're not seriously planning to give him the land," Pete Garrison said. "I'm planning to give him enough rope to hang himself," Clara replied. "Mrs. Henderson, can you make sure this letter reaches Judge Morrison tonight? And can you also send a telegram to the federal marshal in Denver? Tell him that if he wants to catch a territorial judge in the act of accepting forged documents, he should be in Durango tomorrow at noon." The church bell struck 8 o'clock as neighbors scattered to spread word of tomorrow's confrontation. Clara stood at her kitchen window, looking out at the barn's smoldering remains, while Ezra's hand settled warm on her shoulder. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "I'm sure," she said, covering his hand with hers. "Morrison thinks he can take our land because he's a judge, and we're just settlers. But he forgot something important." "What's that?" Clara smiled, feeling the baby move restless inside her, feeling the strength of the community they'd built, feeling the weight of justice finally tipping in their favor. "He forgot that I used to be a schoolteacher, and schoolteachers know how to catch cheaters." The next morning dawned clear and bright, with spring sunshine slanting through the church windows as the people of Durango filed into pews for what would become the most memorable service in the church's short history. Judge Morrison arrived precisely at noon, accompanied by 2 hired men and carrying a leather portfolio that he clearly expected to fill with deed papers. Federal Marshal Tom Bradley had arrived on the morning stage, dressed like a traveling preacher, but carrying a badge in his vest pocket and a keen interest in territorial land fraud. He sat in the back pew, watching everything with the quiet attention of a man who'd learned to spot guilt in the smallest gestures. Clara stood at the altar beside Ezra, the hat box open on the pulpit, documents arranged like an offering. She looked out at the packed church, her students in the front rows, neighbors filling every pew, Judge Morrison in his customary spot near the door, ready for a quick exit once he'd claimed his prize. "Thank you all for coming," Clara said, her voice carrying clear to the back of the church. We're here today to settle a legal matter concerning the land my husband and I call home. Judge Morrison has presented documents showing a prior claim that predates ours by several months. Morrison nodded, looking satisfied. That's correct, Mrs. Hawkins. Though I appreciate your cooperation in this matter, it really wasn't necessary to involve the whole community. Oh, but it was, Clara said. You see, when someone tries to steal land that belongs to honest settlers, I believe the whole community should witness what happens next. She picked up the original documents from the hatbox, Morrison's forged filing, the territorial clerk's analysis, and a sworn statement from William Chen detailing the evidence of fraud. These documents show that Judge Morrison's claim was forged, created months after my husband's legitimate filing, using the wrong type of ink, and backdated to appear authentic. The church went dead silent. Morrison's face flushed red, then pale. That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Hawkins. I hope you have proof. I do. Clara gestured toward the back of the church. Marshal Bradley, would you like to examine these documents? The federal marshal rose from his pew and walked forward, his footsteps echoing in the sudden hush. He studied the papers Clara handed him, then looked at Judge Morrison with the flat, measuring gaze of a lawman who'd seen every kind of corruption the frontier had to offer. Judge Morrison, Marshal Bradley said, you're under arrest for territorial land fraud, forgery of federal documents, and conspiracy to defraud settlers of legally filed homestead claims. The hired men Morrison had brought started to move, hands drifting toward their guns, but they found themselves facing not just the marshal, but a church full of ranchers and miners who'd had enough of corruption and stolen land. Pete Garrison stood up, then Jim Webster, then a dozen other men who'd built their lives with honest work and weren't about to let anyone take it away. Morrison looked around the church, seeing his situation clearly for the first time. This is all a misunderstanding, he said. I have rights, legal standing. You have the right to remain silent, Marshal Bradley said, producing handcuffs from his coat. Which I'd recommend, since anything you say now will be used in your federal trial. As the marshal led Morrison toward the door, Clara felt Ezra's hand slip into hers, warm and steady. Around them, neighbors began to talk in excited whispers about justice finally being served and land claims finally being secure. The children started to giggle, not fully understanding what had happened, but sensing the adults' relief and celebration. Is it over? Ezra asked quietly. Clara nodded, one hand resting on the hatbox that had held their most important papers, the other pressed to her belly where their child grew safe and strong. It's over. We can build our new barn, plant our garden, raise our family. This is home, Ezra. Really and truly home. The church bell struck 1 o'clock as the congregation slowly filed out into the spring sunshine, talking and laughing, making plans for a barn raising and a proper celebration. Clara and Ezra were the last to leave, standing together at the altar where they'd been married just 5 months before. I'm impressed, Ezra said with a smile. Clara laughed, remembering her words from that first morning when he'd gentled the Mustang in the street. What changed your mind? You did, he said, and kissed her while sunlight streamed through the colored glass windows, painting rainbows on the wooden floor where their future stretched ahead, secure and bright as Colorado gold. 6 months later, on a crisp October morning when the aspen leaves blazed gold against the mountains, Clara stood in the doorway of their new barn and watched Ezra gentle another Mustang in the paddock. Their son slept in her arms, born 3 weeks early but healthy and strong, with his father's steady temperament and what Mrs. Henderson insisted were his mother's intelligent eyes. The hat box sat on the kitchen table now, no longer holding documents and papers but baby clothes and rattles, a silver spoon from the territorial governor congratulating them on their role in breaking up the land fraud scheme, and letters from former students who'd moved on to other towns but still wrote to their favorite teacher, Mrs. Hawkins, called Mary Jenkins, one of her older students. Are you coming to the Harvest Festival? In just a moment, Clara called back, adjusting the blanket around baby Thomas, named for the man who'd loved her first. With Ezra's full blessing and understanding, the Mustang in the paddock had stopped bucking and stood quiet, ears forward, accepting Ezra's gentle hands on her neck. Clara watched her husband work, patient and sure, building trust one careful touch at a time. It was the same way he'd approached their marriage, their land, their future with steady hands and an understanding that the best things in life couldn't be forced, only earned. The church bell rang 10 o'clock, calling the community to celebration, and Clara stepped out into the golden morning light. Their land stretched before them, secure and legally theirs, dotted with cattle and crossed by the clear stream where Ezra had first shown her the spot where he wanted to build their home. The barn rose solid and strong, built by neighbors who'd come together after Morrison's arrest, who'd worked side by side to replace what corruption had tried to destroy. Inside, hay was stacked sweet and high, ready for winter. The garden had produced more tomatoes than they could eat, and Clara's root cellar was full of preserved vegetables that would carry them through the cold months ahead. Not bad for a dare, Ezra said, joining her in the doorway with his hat in his hands and sawdust in his hair. Not bad at all, Clara agreed, shifting baby Thomas to her hip and taking her husband's arm. Though I still say I wasn't impressed that first morning. And now? Clara looked around at everything they'd built together. The land, the home,